began with a sound that didn't belong there. Hammering. Sharp, deliberate, confident. The kind of noise that assumes permission without asking for it. Mark heard it before he saw anything, standing barefoot on his porch with a half-cold mug of coffee. The morning still quiet enough that every strike echoed across the field. At first, he thought it was distant construction, maybe a contractor working on the road. But the sound was too close, too personal. When he stepped off the porch and walked toward the tree line, the truth came into view like an insult you can't unhear. A fence. New wood. Fresh posts. Straight lines cutting across land that had been open for decades. It wasn't crooked or rushed. It was confident, permanent, like it had every right to be there. Mark stopped walking. His coffee went untouched. His mind took a moment to catch up to his eyes, and when it did, the confusion hit first. Not anger. Not yet. Confusion has a quieter voice. It asks questions instead of making accusations. Who would build this? Why here? How could someone be so wrong? He walked closer, boots sinking slightly into the soil he knew better than any map. He knew every uneven patch, every place the grass grew thinner. His father had shown him this land when he was a kid, pointed at trees and said, "That one's ours, that one too, everything up to that bend." Those words didn't fade. They stayed. And this fence? It didn't just cross the line. It ignored it completely. The closer he got, the clearer it became. The fence wasn't new by accident. It was new by intention. Survey straight, professionally set. Someone had paid money to put this here. Someone had decided that Mark's land was no longer Mark's problem. That's when confusion started losing ground. Mark walked the length of it slowly, like a detective at a crime scene. He found the old survey marker half a foot inside the fence line, orange paint still visible on the metal rod. He bent down, wiped dirt off it with his thumb, and felt his jaw tighten. This wasn't a gray area. This wasn't a mistake. This was trespass with confidence. He stood there longer than he realized, letting the reality settle. The fence didn't just block space. It changed the feeling of the land. Open ground suddenly felt smaller. Familiar air felt restricted. A line had been drawn without his consent, and lines have a way of turning neighbors into enemies. The hammering had stopped now. Silence returned, but it felt heavier than before. Silence can be loud when it follows disrespect. Mark went back inside not because he was done, but because he needed proof. He pulled the old folder from the cabinet, the one with yellowed papers and folded maps. The survey was there, just like he remembered. Clear measurements, clear boundaries, clear ownership. He spread it across the kitchen table and stared at it, not because he doubted it, but because he needed to remind himself that he wasn't crazy, that this land wasn't up for debate. He grabbed his phone and went back outside. Photos first. Wide shots. Close-ups. The survey marker next to the fence post. The fence post driven deep into his side of the line. Every angle. Every detail. Because experience had taught him something important. The truth matters less if you can't prove it. That afternoon, the neighbor appeared. Gary had lived next door for less than 3 years. Friendly enough on the surface. Always smiling, always waving, the kind of man who talked about property values and improvements like they were hobbies instead of obsessions. He walked over with his hands in his pockets, eyes scanning the fence like a proud owner admiring new furniture. "Nice, isn't it?" Gary said, smiling. Mark didn't smile back. "That fence is on my land." Gary chuckled lightly, the sound of someone who didn't expect resistance. "I don't think so. My guy checked the lines." Mark held up his phone and showed him the photos. The marker, the measurements, the fence post where it didn't belong. Gary glanced at the screen for less than a second. "Those surveys can be outdated," Gary said. "Land shifts. Lines change. Land shifts. Lines change." Mark felt something snap quietly behind his ribs. Not rage. Something colder. Something clearer. "Land doesn't move," Mark said. "People do." Gary's smile thinned, but it didn't disappear. "Look, if you think there's a problem, you can talk to a lawyer. I'm just protecting what's mine." Mark looked at the fence again. at the wood, at the nails, at the certainty behind every post. "No," he said calmly. "You're taking what isn't." Gary shrugged. "We'll see." And that was the moment everything changed. Gary walked away like the conversation was finished, like the fence had settled the matter. Mark stood there alone again, the fence between him and the part of his land that suddenly felt stolen. He realized something then that people don't talk about enough. Disrespect isn't always loud. Sometimes it's polite. Sometimes it smiles at you and tells you to get a lawyer. That night, Mark didn't sleep much. Not because he was angry, but because his mind kept replaying the same thought. If he did nothing, the fence would become normal. And once something becomes normal, removing it gets harder. People accept theft when it looks permanent. By morning, he had made a decision. Not the final one. Not yet. But the first one. He wasn't going to let silence decide this. The second day felt different. The land looked the same. The fence still stood where it didn't belong. But something underneath the surface had shifted. Mark woke up before his alarm. That tight, alert feeling already in his chest. Like his body had decided the argument wasn't over even if the conversation was. He stood at the window longer than usual, staring out at the fence as if it might move on its own if he watched hard enough. Didn't. It just sat there, quiet and arrogant, claiming space without saying a word. People like to think conflict explodes all at once. It doesn't. Creeps in. Settles. It makes coffee taste bitter and mornings feel heavier than they should. Mark went through his routine on autopilot. Boots on, keys in pocket, phone charged. He didn't rush. He didn't hesitate either. He walked straight toward the fence again. This time not as a confused landowner, but as someone gathering evidence for a fight he didn't ask for. Up close, the details annoyed him even more. The posts were sunk deep, concrete still visible at the base like a signature. The boards were clean, smooth, expensive. This wasn't a quick boundary marker. This was a statement. Gary hadn't just built a fence. He'd invested in it. And people don't invest in things they plan to give up easily. Mark paced the line slowly, recording video this time. He narrated quietly, not for drama, but for clarity. Where the marker was, where the fence stood, how far inside the line it cut. He made sure his voice stayed calm. Calm sounds credible. Calm sounds like someone who knows he's right. Halfway through, he noticed movement on the other side. Gary was outside again, pretending to check something on his phone while clearly watching. That kind of watching that tries to look casual but never is. Mark didn't stop recording. He didn't look away. He didn't wave. Gary eventually walked closer, stopping just short of the fence. "You really going all in on this?" he asked. Mark lowered the phone but didn't turn it off. "I'm documenting trespass." Gary laughed, but it came out sharper this time. "You know how these things go. Long process. Expensive. Stressful. Is it really worth it over a few feet?" A few feet. That phrase did more damage than Gary probably realized. Because land isn't measured in feet when it belongs to you. It's measured in principle. It's measured in how much you're willing to let slide before you stop recognizing yourself. "It's worth it," Mark said, "because it's mine." Gary leaned against one of the posts, casually putting weight on it like it had always been his. Then let the courts decide. That was the second power move. The first was building the fence. The second was daring Mark to fight him on paper instead of ground. Mark didn't respond. He turned and walked back toward his house, phone still recording until he reached the porch. He ended the video there and stood still for a moment, listening to the quiet hum of the morning. Birds didn't care about property lines. Wind didn't respect fences. Only people did this to each other. Inside, Mark made calls. The county office was first. He explained the situation slowly, clearly, with dates and details. The woman on the other end sounded tired but professional, the kind of voice that had heard 100 variations of the same story. She asked for parcel numbers. He gave them. She pulled up the map. There was a pause. "According to our records," she said, "the fence is inside your property line." Mark exhaled, not in relief, but in confirmation. "What are my options?" "Well," she said carefully, You can file a formal complaint that usually leads to notices, hearings, possibly months. And removal? Another pause. If a structure is built on your land without permission, you are generally within your rights to remove it, as long as you document everything and don't damage anything beyond the structure itself. Generally within your rights. That phrase stayed with him after the call ended. It wasn't a green light. It wasn't a red one either. It was a yellow, flickering, waiting for a decision. Mark spent the afternoon doing more research. Old emails. Old records. He found photos from years ago showing the open land. No fence, nothing blocking the view. He saved everything to a folder, labeled and dated. He wasn't just preparing to act. He was preparing to be questioned after he did. That evening, Gary had company. 2 men stood near the fence with him, beers in hand, laughing. They leaned against the wood, talking loudly enough to be heard. Mark didn't need to hear the words to understand the message. Normalizing it, making it social, turning Mark into the unreasonable one for objecting. Mark watched from his porch, arms crossed, face unreadable. He didn't yell. He didn't approach. He let the scene play out, because sometimes the smartest move is letting someone think they've already won. Night came, and with it, doubt tried to sneak in. Doubt always does. What if this got ugly? What if Gary pushed back harder? What if this turned into a legal nightmare? Mark sat at his kitchen table again. Papers spread out. The same survey he'd looked at the day before. The lines hadn't changed. The truth hadn't changed. Only the pressure had. He thought about his father again. About the way he'd said, "If you don't protect what's yours, someone else will decide it's theirs." At the time, it had sounded old-fashioned. Now it felt like a warning. Around midnight, Mark made the decision he'd been circling all day. Not the dramatic one. Not yet. But the point of no return. He sent one last message to Gary. Short, clear, documented. "The fence is on my property. I've confirmed this with the county. Please remove it within 48 hours. He didn't add emotion. He didn't add threats. Just facts and time. The reply came faster than he expected. "No. See you in court." Mark stared at the screen for a long moment. Not because he was shocked, but because the certainty in those words removed any remaining hesitation. Gary wasn't confused. Gary wasn't mistaken. Gary was daring him. The next morning, Mark went to the garage. He didn't start the chainsaw. He didn't even touch it yet. He just stood there, looking at it on the shelf, dusted but ready. Tools don't have intentions. People do. The chainsaw was just an object like the fence. What mattered was the line that had been crossed long before any blade would. Mark turned away and closed the garage door. Not today, he thought, but soon. And somewhere behind that fence, Gary was already acting like the land was his, unaware that confidence without permission has a short lifespan. The morning came without ceremony. No dramatic sunrise. No storm clouds. Just ordinary light spilling across land that was anything but calm. Mark noticed that first, the normalcy of it all. The world hadn't paused to acknowledge the line someone had crossed. Birds still cut through the air. The grass still bent under the breeze. Only the fence stood there, stubborn and unchanged, like it believed time itself was on its side. Mark drank his coffee slowly, not because he was relaxed, but because he wanted his hands steady. Big decisions don't always arrive with adrenaline. Sometimes they arrive with silence and patience, testing whether you'll flinch. He didn't. He finished the cup, rinsed it, and set it upside down in the sink. Small routines matter when you're about to do something irreversible. He checked his phone. No new messages. The 48 hours hadn't passed yet. But Gary's reply from the night before echoed louder than any clock. "See you in court." Those words weren't a warning. They were a dismissal. A way of saying the fence was staying no matter what was fair or legal, because intimidation had already done its job before. Mark stepped outside and walked the property line one more time. Not to doubt himself, but to ground himself. He stopped at the survey marker again, pressing his boot next to it, measuring the distance to the fence post with his eyes. It wasn't close. It wasn't arguable. Anyone who said otherwise was lying or hoping he wouldn't push back. He took more photos, new angles, clear daylight, the marker, the fence, the distance between them. He spoke the date and time out loud while recording video. Calm voice, measured words, no anger, no threats. He wasn't performing. He was protecting himself from the version of the story that would try to paint him as reckless later. Then he went back to the garage. This time he didn't turn away. The chainsaw was heavier than he remembered, or maybe the weight just felt different when the purpose changed. He checked the chain, the fuel, the tension. Not in a rush. Rushing leads to mistakes, and mistakes give the other side ammunition. He put on gloves, ear protection, eye gear. This wasn't a tantrum. It was work. As he rolled the garage door up, the sound echoed across the yard. That sound alone felt like a declaration. He paused there for a moment, breathing in the smell of oil and cut grass, letting the reality settle fully. Once the first cut was made, there would be no pretending this was still a conversation. Mark walked toward the fence. Each step felt deliberate, like he was crossing a threshold instead of grass. The chainsaw wasn't running yet. It hung silent in his hands, waiting. He stopped at the first post, placed his foot beside the marker again, and looked down the line one final time. He pulled the cord. The engine roared to life, loud and unapologetic, ripping through the quiet morning like it had been waiting for this moment. The sound carried. It always does. Tools like that announce themselves whether you want them to or not. Mark held it steady, feeling the vibration travel up his arms, grounding him in the now. He didn't hesitate. The blade met the first post low just above the concrete. Wood resisted for a split second before giving in, the fibers tearing apart with a sharp crack. The post leaned, then fell, hitting the ground with a thud that felt louder than it should have. Not because of the sound, but because of what it meant. Fence was no longer untouchable. Mark moved to the next section, cutting cleanly, methodically, panel by panel, post by post. He wasn't destroying. He was dismantling. Each cut was controlled. Each movement intentional. This wasn't rage. Rage is sloppy. This was resolution. Halfway down the line, he heard shouting. Gary's voice, sharp and frantic now. Not the calm confidence from before. Mark didn't stop. He didn't even look up at first. He finished the cut he was on, shut the saw down, and then turned. Gary was running toward the fence from his house. Phone in hand, face red, words tumbling over each other in a panic that came too late. What the hell do you think you're doing? He yelled. Mark rested the chainsaw on the ground and looked at him. Calm, steady, almost tired. Removing a structure built on my land, he said. You can't do this, Gary shouted. This is illegal. I'm calling the police. Mark nodded once. I've already spoken to the county. You built it illegally. I documented everything. Gary crossed the remaining distance and grabbed one of the loose panels, trying to prop it back up like he could reverse time with his hands. You should have waited. This is why courts exist. This is why property lines exist, Mark replied. Gary pointed his phone at him now, recording, his voice rising, trying to create chaos on camera. He's destroying my fence. This guy's crazy. Mark didn't react. He picked up the chainsaw again, started it, and went back to work. The sound drowned Gary out completely. No argument survives a running chainsaw. Within minutes, the remaining sections were down. Wood lay scattered across the ground. No longer a boundary, just debris. The land looked open again, like it could finally breathe. The police arrived 20 minutes later. 2 officers stepped out, hands resting casually near their belts, eyes moving from the fallen fence to the survey marker to the chainsaw on the ground. They listened. They asked questions. Mark answered calmly, showing photos, videos, emails, messages. Gary talked over himself. Angry, inconsistent, emotional. One officer walked the line himself, measuring, checking the marker. The other reviewed the documents. After a while, one of them spoke. The fence was built on his property, he said, nodding toward Mark. He has the right to remove it. Gary's face went pale. So that's it? He just gets away with this? The officer shook his head. This could have been avoided if you'd built on your own land. The silence that followed was different from the ones before. This one carried weight. Finality. As the police left, Gary stood there staring at the mess, the confidence completely gone. Mark picked up the fallen panels and stacked them neatly along the edge of the property. He wasn't petty. He wasn't cruel. He just wanted his land back. By the time the sun started to lower, the fence was nothing more than a pile of wood and a lesson someone hadn't wanted to learn. Mark stood at the property line one last time, looking out over the open ground. No barrier, no argument, just space reclaimed. And for the first time since the hammering started days ago, the land felt like his again. The quiet that followed felt earned. Not peaceful at first, but honest. The kind of silence that settles in after something has been confronted instead of avoided. Mark noticed it that evening while standing on his porch, watching the shadows stretch back across the open land. No fence, no noise, just the way it had always been. The absence felt louder than the chainsaw ever had. Gary didn't come back out that night. His house stayed dark, blinds drawn, like retreat could undo embarrassment. Mark didn't feel victory in the way movies promise. There was no rush, no grin, no satisfaction in someone else losing. What he felt instead was alignment. Things were where they were supposed to be again. That mattered more than pride. The next few days passed slowly, but not uneasily. Mark kept to his routine. Morning walks along the line. Small repairs around the house. Life returning to its usual rhythm, except now there was an awareness layered on top of it. A reminder that peace isn't passive. It's maintained. On the third day, a certified letter arrived. Mark recognized the format before he opened it. Legal language has a smell to it. Ink and intimidation. Gary was filing a complaint, claiming destruction of property, emotional distress, boundary dispute. It was messy, poorly structured, and clearly written by someone still angry rather than strategic. Mark read it once, then again, then set it down without reaction. He added it to the folder. That folder had grown thick now. Photos, videos, county confirmations, messages, police report numbers. Everything told the same story from a different angle, and stories like that don't collapse under pressure. They hold. Mark contacted a local attorney, not because he was scared, but because preparation is cheaper than regret. The consultation was short. The attorney listened, reviewed the documents, and leaned back in his chair with a look that said more than words. "You did exactly what you were allowed to do," he said, "and exactly what most people are too hesitant to." Mark nodded. "So what happens now?" "If he pushes," the attorney replied, "he loses, and probably pays your fees." That night, Mark slept deeply for the first time since the hammering began. A week later, Gary finally approached him again. Not confidently this time. No casual smile. No waving from a distance. He walked up slowly, hands visible, posture stiff, like someone approaching an animal that might still bite. Mark was fixing a section of fencing near his barn, his own fencing well within his line. He saw Gary coming but didn't stop working. Gary cleared his throat. "Look, we need to talk." Mark finished tightening the wire before standing up. He wiped his hands on his jeans and faced him. "About what?" Gary shifted his weight. The ground didn't feel as solid to him anymore. "This whole thing got out of hand." "That's one way to say it," Mark replied. "I shouldn't have built the fence there," Gary said quietly, the words clearly painful to release. I thought if it stayed long enough, it would just become a thing." Mark studied him for a moment, not with anger, with curiosity. "That happens a lot," he said. "People mistake time for permission." Gary nodded. "I'm dropping the complaint." The words hung there, fragile, like they might break if examined too closely. "Good," Mark said, not smug, just factual. "I'll pay for removal," Gary added quickly. "I mean, what's left of it, and I'll get a new survey done. Official. On my side." Mark considered him for a long moment. This was the part most stories skip. The moment after the climax. where real life has to continue between people who now know each other differently. Do that, Mark said, and keep it on your land. Gary nodded again. Yeah. He hesitated, then added, you didn't have to use a chainsaw. Mark almost smiled. Almost. You didn't have to build the fence. Gary had no answer for that. He turned and walked away, shoulders slumped, confidence stripped down to something more cautious, maybe even respectful. Word spread as it always does. Neighbors who had watched quietly now asked questions. Some with curiosity, some with admiration, some with thinly veiled relief that it hadn't been them. Mark didn't exaggerate the story. He didn't dramatize it. He just told the truth. The fence was on his land. He asked for it to be removed. It wasn't, so he did it himself. The simplicity of it unsettled people more than anger ever could. A month later, new survey flags appeared along Gary's actual boundary, this time well inside his side. A smaller, cheaper fence followed. It stayed where it belonged. No one clapped. No one commented. And that was exactly how it should have been from the start. Mark stood at the edge of his property one evening, watching the sun dip low, casting long shadows across uninterrupted ground. The land didn't know what had happened. It didn't remember conflict. It just existed, waiting for whoever stood on it to decide how much it was worth. He thought about how close he'd come to doing nothing, about how easy it would have been to let paperwork drag on, to let months pass, to slowly accept less space than he owned because confrontation felt uncomfortable. That's how lines disappear. Not all at once, but quietly, while people convince themselves it isn't worth the trouble. But some things are worth the trouble, not because they're dramatic, not because they make good stories, but because once you let someone redraw your boundaries, you spend the rest of your life living smaller without realizing why. The chainsaw was back in the garage now, clean, silent, just a tool again. It hadn't been the point. It never was. The point was the decision behind it. The refusal to be pressured into surrender by someone who mistook politeness for weakness. Mark turned back toward his house. The land opened behind him, unchanged and fully his. Somewhere down the line, someone would probably tell this story differently. Louder, sharper, with more drama than it deserved. But Mark would remember it simply. Someone built where they didn't belong. He removed it, and the land remembered who stood for it.